Hello and welcome to the second part of the Path to Union with the Divine Ground, the essential teaching of four spiritual traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism and Christianity, a lecture series by Dr. Anne Baring. And today we will hear from her on Buddhism. Over to you, dear Anne.
Thank you, Georgie, and welcome to everybody. I hope you're all safe and not too worried about the virus. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the help that I had from Emeritus Professor Chris Beisch, who gave me his notes from his seminars in Ohio University, where he was professor for many years. So thank you, Chris. So, Buddhism. The word Buddha means awake or one who is awake. When people ask the Buddha, "Are you a god? Are you an angel? Are you a saint?" He answered, "No, I am none of these." "What are you then?" they asked. "I am awake," was his reply. Whereas Hinduism has no one individual at its heart, Buddhism has an individual so extraordinary and charismatic, so brilliant a teacher with such profound psychological insight that millions flocked to listen to him during his 45 years of teaching in India. The veneration in which he was held was universal and unique. I think that, like Jesus 500 years later, he was someone who came to this planet from higher regions of the cosmos to help humanity. The Buddha knew he had a cosmic mission to accomplish. I will return to his life later, but first I would like to offer a few facts about Buddhism in general. This is a map showing the number of Buddhists today in the world. It's 470 million followers. But it's quite a tiny proportion in relation to Christianity and Islam, which is Islam is in green, Christianity in blue. So when the Buddha passed away around 483 BC, his followers began to organize a monastic movement, and the Buddha's teachings became the foundation for what would develop into Buddhism. In the 3rd century BC, the Emperor Ashoka converted to Buddhism and made Buddhism the state religion of India. In the 1st century AD, there were Buddhist universities in India, for example, at Taxila in what is now Pakistan, where the Buddhist scriptures were taught. It is possible that Jesus spent some years in them prior to the start of his mission. Over the next few centuries, Buddhism began to spread beyond India, northeast along the Silk Road into Tibet and China, and south into Sri Lanka and southeast into Burma, Cambodia, and Indonesia. In the 6th century, the White Huns invaded India and destroyed hundreds of Buddhist monasteries. They were a terrifying phenomenon. And in the 16th century, the Mughals invaded India and Islam spread rapidly, destroying many shrines and temples and forcing Buddhism into retreat. Now, there were 3 main schools in Buddhism. And the first school is called the Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, also known as Theravada Buddhism, which means the teaching of the elders. And this was the first school to be established in Sri Lanka, then in Thailand, in Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. Hinayana is regarded as the belief system closest to the one taught by the Buddha himself, and is based on the recollections of the Buddha's teachings that were compiled by the elders, the monks who were the Buddha's closest companions. However, astonishingly, the Buddha wrote nothing down during his 45 years of teaching, and the earliest records of what he said were only written down nearly 150 years after his death. Theravada Buddhism was one of 18 schools that existed in the centuries after the Buddha's death. It spread from India to Sri Lanka and then to Burma and Southeast Asia, and remained close to the original Pali canon. The other 17 schools disappeared in India in the invasion by the White Huns in the 6th century AD. And in the 16th century again, when the Muslims swept into northern India and destroyed the remaining Buddhist monasteries that were established there. This may explain the weakness of Buddhism as opposed to Hinduism in India. Theravada Buddhism stressed the enlightenment of the individual, self-discipline, the importance of pure thought and deed, and the importance of the monastic life. It has distinct roles for monks and lay people, emphasizing that each individual is responsible for his or her salvation. It takes the view that only monks are capable of reaching enlightenment or becoming an arhat or arahant. The pictures are of the Buddha in Sri Lanka on your left, and of the Bayon at Angkor in Cambodia, which is the most extraordinary place. If ever you can have a chance to go there, I would certainly advise you to, because it's amazing. Now we come secondly to Mahayana Buddhism, called the Greater Vehicle. It's the more liberal form of Buddhism, and in this tradition, the Bodhisattva returns to help humanity. It is the form of Buddhism that took root in China, in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam. Mahayana Buddhism encompasses a wide range of philosophical schools, metaphysical beliefs, and practical meditative disciplines. It is more widespread and has more followers than Theravada Buddhism. Both traditions teach the noble Eightfold Path and the Four Truths. In Japan, Zen Buddhism was a branch of Mahayana Buddhism, which originated in China. And these pictures are from two caves in China, the Maishishan caves and the Tunhuang caves, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. And thirdly, we have Vajrayana Buddhism, the diamond vehicle. This form of Buddhism existed in Tibet from the 8th century. That's quite a few centuries after the time of the Buddha, and later in Nepal, Bhutan, and Mongolia. It is represented in exile by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In the 8th century AD, a Buddhist monk called Padmasambhava crossed the mountains from India into Tibet and converted many people to Tantricism, a form of Mahayana Buddhism. He transformed a nation of warriors into a vast community of monks, no mean feat. A later monk from Bengal called Atisa, Dipamkara, was also a great tantric teacher, both in India and Tibet, where he spent the last 12 years of his life. After the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1950 and the catastrophic destruction of their monasteries and centuries-old way of life, many monks, including the Dalai Lama, fled to the West, risking their lives on the perilous route from Tibet into India. They established a center in India at Dharamshala, a city on the edge of the Himalayas, which has since become the home to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile. From there, monks spread out to establish temples and teaching centers in the Vajrayana tradition in Europe and America and as far as Australia. And these have provided sanctuary as well as retreats for those wishing to deepen their spiritual practice and their understanding of Buddhism. I would recommend the books of the Dalai Lama, particularly Beyond Religion, Ethics for the Whole World, and his astounding booklet, A Call for Revolution, which was published in 2017, in which he appeals directly to young people to start a revolution in compassion. It's an extraordinary booklet, and I advise you to buy it. He has said that the only religion we need is kindness, and that as a guide to life, we don't need any more than this. Now here, once again, is a map of the Silk Road, which was the great connecting path between India and China. All along its route, Buddhist paintings have been found in caves such as those of Tunhuang, Maichishan, and Lungmen in China. Quite extraordinary, the amount of artistic work that came from Buddhism. Now this map, which I've had in my possession since 1956, can you believe it, shows the a sort of expansion of Buddhism from India into Tibet, into China, into Korea, into Japan, and southwards into Thailand, into Indonesia, and into Sri Lanka or Ceylon. So it's quite extraordinary. And the dotted lines are the routes of Chinese travelers, very early ones, who, one of the northern route and the other the southern sea route, who recorded what they found on their journeys. I'll come back to that later. Buddhism developed out of Hinduism, but it did not replace it in India. It spread rapidly through Asia and into Tibet, where it fused with ancient shamanic practices that had long existed there. It reached China and Afghanistan via the Silk Road, and it reached Japan from China. Everywhere it took root, it inspired the building of wonderful stupas and the most marvelous sculptures, as well as frescoes painted on cave walls. The gigantic sculptures of the Buddha at Bamyan in Afghanistan, now restored after being destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. The mysterious temples of Angkor in Cambodia, which were originally Hindu and then Buddhist. The innumerable temple stupas at Pagan in the north of Burma, Myanmar. The enormous temple stupa of Borobudur in Java. The magnificent sculptures of the Buddha in Sri Lanka. The exquisite frescoes in the Ajanta caves in India and Tunhuang in China, and the thousands of statues of the Buddha in all these countries bear witness to the sublime art and architecture that accompanied the spread of Buddhism throughout Asia. Something seems to be happening today. Yes, this is the temple of Borobudur, which I went to. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's huge, and you go in a circumambulatory path round and round and round until you reach the top. And on the top, where you see those little triangles, each one is a statue of the Buddha, gazing out into the landscape. So the men who designed and built the enormous stupas and temples were incredible engineers, mathematicians, and architects. Angkor Wat and Borobudur in particular are witness to their genius. And all this is the legacy of the Buddha. All these Buddhist marvels of human creativity brought a message of hope and the teaching that all men and women had the potential of realizing their Buddha nature. This was like rain falling on parched earth, liberating people from the limited view they had of themselves and the oppressive weight of their religious beliefs and their social customs. The 1,000 Buddha caves at Tunhuang in China, situated on the Silk Road, were walled up in the 11th century AD. No one knows why, and only discovered in the early part of the last century by Sir Aurel Stein, a British-Hungarian explorer and archaeologist, who is said to have discovered the Silk Road. What he discovered was like an Asian Tutankhamun's tomb. These caves contain absolute marvels of Buddhist art. Thousands of frescoes painted with dazzling colors, lapis blue, ruby red, gold, emerald green. And they show that a highly developed civilization once existed in this remote and inaccessible part of the world. Now I can come to the life and teaching of the Buddha. The baby who would become the Buddha was born in the year 563 BC. Into a noble family in the small state of Kapilavastu on the borders of Nepal. He was named Siddhartha, which means he who reaches his goal. His family name was Gautama. Later he was called Shakyamuni Buddha, meaning the sage of the Shakyas, to distinguish him from other Buddhas past and to come. His mother, Queen Maya, gave birth to him prematurely, holding onto a branch of the sal tree in a grove in the Lumbini Park, not far from Kapilavastu. Legend says that he took 7 steps when he was born, and at each step a lotus flowered. He also announced that this would be his last incarnation. His mother tragically died 7 days after his birth. There is no mention of the grief that must have filled the palace when she died, leaving her infant son motherless. He was apparently cared for by another of his father's wives, whose name was Mahaprajapati. At his birth, astrologers predicted that he would either be a great leader, a universal king, who would unify India, or a great spiritual leader. He was given the best possible education and was brought up in the greatest luxury, heir to his father's kingdom. He grew up to be handsome, extremely intelligent, and gifted in every way. His father gave him 3 beautiful different palaces to live in, one for each season. He was married young to a beautiful woman called Yasodhara, who was chosen to be his bride, and she bore him a son, Rahula. The Buddha's long earlobes, one of his distinguishing marks as a Buddha, may have been formed by the heavy jewels or weights inserted into them when he was growing up. The other significant mark was the mound on top of his head. During his 20s, Siddhartha grew discontented. He knew something was missing. His father did everything he could to set his feet on the path of a princely leader, preventing him from seeing any sign of old age, sickness, and death. But on successive days outside the palace walls, he encountered all 3 of these, and also a mendicant, a holy man. And these encounters changed his life. They were his first glimpse of human suffering and a possible path that he could follow. So, at the age of 29, he left his palace, his sleeping wife and young son, and rode out into the night with only one attendant and his beloved horse, Kantaka. He disappeared into the forest, carrying nothing with him. When Kantaka returned to the palace, it is said that he was reproached by Siddhartha's father and dropped dead at his feet, overcome by grief and remorse. This is the story of how Siddhartha renounced his princely heritage and his family and embarked on the life of a wandering ascetic for 6 years. And this was known as the Great Renunciation. His first act was apparently to seek out 2 of the foremost Hindu rishis of the day and sit at their feet, imbibing their wisdom and learning their method of meditation. It is not known where he found them, how long he stayed with them, or what he learnt from them. But it is important to remember that Siddhartha would have been brought up as a Hindu. He next moved into a phase of severe asceticism with a similarly inclined group of 5 other men. And this is one of the many images of the fasting Buddha. This phase is said to have lasted 6 years. He would have been about 35 then. And legend says that his mother, on seeing her beloved son near to death, came to him deeply distraught and begged him to take some food. Weak to the point of fainting, he broke his fast when he accepted a cup of warm rice gruel offered to him by a young woman called Sujata. Without it, he might well have died. Recognizing that asceticism was not achieving what he sought, and remembering an experience of mystical contemplation that he once had in his youth, he rejected this ascetic path to enlightenment. Sometime later, he came to a Bodhi tree, and seated beneath it on the coils of the great Naga serpent king, Musalinda, and protected by his outspread hoods, Siddhartha spent the night in intense meditation. He had to face 3 temptations offered by the fearsome demon Mara. He had to reject the temptation of lust offered by 3 beautiful women, and then the temptation of fear in the face of an army of terrifying monsters who hurled rocks and hurricanes sent by the demon. And finally, the temptation of power and his right to follow the path he had chosen. Seeing that his efforts were having no effect, Mara challenged Siddhartha, saying, "Who will speak for you?" And Siddhartha put out his right hand to touch the earth, as he's doing in this picture. And the earth spoke, saying, "I bear you witness." At this, Mara vanished, and as the morning star rose in the dawn sky, Siddhartha awakened to cosmic consciousness and to his Buddha nature. This is my own note added in here. What is described here is a shamanic experience of cosmic consciousness. It is interesting that what drew him to this experience was an earlier memory of mystical contemplation. The fact that the Buddha sits on the coils of the great serpent, who is the spirit of the earth itself, and also that he sits beneath a tree, the tree of life mythologically, are both associated with shamanic initiation. I would suggest that you read Richard Buck's book, Cosmic Consciousness, for an exploration of this experience and the individuals who have experienced it, including the Buddha and Jesus, because it's absolutely fascinating. It was written in 2001, in 1901. That's 120 years ago, but it's still available. And it's not expensive. So, in a state of hugely expanded and illumined consciousness, the Buddha exclaimed, "Now art thou seen, O builder. Never again shalt thou build house for me. Broken are the beams and sundered lies the ridgepole. My mind is set on the eternal. Extinguished is all desire." Siddhartha remained where he was in a state of samadhi or cosmic consciousness for 49 days. And during this time, he had a vision of the vast suffering of humanity that was lost in ignorance and confusion and in desperate need of help and guidance. He became aware that he had a mission to help humanity. Then Mara tried one last temptation, asking Siddhartha why he should bother with the world, since so few would understand his teaching. Why not slip into nirvana and abandon the world? And Siddhartha replied, "There will be some who will understand." Whereupon Mara vanished forever. Now Siddhartha could not have withstood this powerful assault from the collective unconscious in the form of the arch-deceiver Mara, unless he had a very strong ego or sense of self. Mara can be understood to represent the creator of illusion who holds the world in thrall. We might also note Siddhartha's strength on leaving his home, his wife and his son, and his determination to seek enlightenment, his perseverance beneath the Bodhi tree. None of these things would have been accomplished without a strong sense of self, a strong will, and also a sense of destiny. It is important to remember that the Buddha was living and teaching in the middle of the 6th century BC, at a time when the Upanishads were being written. This is the first Buddhist shrine or stupa that was built at Bodh Gaya, the place where he experienced enlightenment, and pilgrims still flock to this site today. Now, there were 4 phases of Siddhartha's awakening. First of all, the memories of all his former lives returned to him, giving him an overview of what is called samsara, or his thousands of incarnations. Secondly, he had revealed to him the chain of causation and the nature of karma. He could see the process of life right from the beginning of creation, probably, to where he was at that time. Thirdly, he saw that the cause of samsara, or this chain of lives, was ignorance or unconsciousness. And fourthly, he woke to the imperishable state of the Buddha nature. He gained omniscience or cosmic consciousness as an abiding state, not a transient mood, emotion, or thought. His first sermon on the 4 noble truths were given in the deer park at Sarnath, to the west of Bodh Gaya. And it is here that he set the wheel of truth in motion and embarked on the path of action, one of the 3 main paths of Hinduism. Now, the first of these 4 noble truths was all of life is suffering. First of all, the Buddha identified the symptoms of suffering, and he said that all human beings are equal in their experience of suffering. All have to experience the trauma of birth, the experience of pain, the distress of getting old and decrepit, of becoming diseased, and ultimately facing death, with the fear, anxiety, and grief that attend upon these experiences. They also endure the states of mind associated with psychological suffering, like loneliness and fear and anxiety, of which we see so much today. Dukkha has the meaning of things being out of joint, out of harmony, out of alignment. all life is suffering means that an unenlightened ego-bound existence is profoundly incomplete and constricted by ignorance or unconsciousness. Secondly, he spoke about the origin of suffering. He made his diagnosis. There is a cause of suffering. Suffering is caused by the craving for safety and security, by fear and anxiety, and the ego's need to be in control, and by being drawn into situations that arouse fear or hatred or anger or jealousy, or the longing for power, I think I'm going to add there. Thirdly, he spoke about the cessation of suffering. He offered a cure, a solution. There can be an end to suffering. Suffering and the fear of it can be overcome. True happiness and contentment are possible if we let go of our craving for security, our anxiety, and our fear, and learn to live each day at a time, not dwelling in the past or in the imagined future. Then we can become happy and free, and we will have time and energy to help others. And fourthly, he spoke about the way to the cessation of suffering. Everyone has a Buddha nature, and everyone can find freedom from ignorance and the craving of desire by seeking enlightenment. In order to end suffering, the Buddha offered the Eightfold Path. And this was his first sermon at Sarnath, which offered radically new ideas in the context of his time. He really was the first psychologist or psychotherapist, absolutely different from the teaching of his time. It is recorded that the Buddha said over and over again that these noble truths he was teaching were not among the doctrines handed down, but that there arose within him the eye to perceive them, the knowledge of their nature, the understanding of their cause, the wisdom that lights the true path, and the light that expels darkness. The Buddha gave these talks in the vernacular of the people he was speaking to, not in Sanskrit, and soon disciples flocked to him. At the end of 3 months, there were 60 already. He decided to adopt the life of a mendicant teacher with the poverty, unpopularity, and opposition from the Brahmin priesthood that such a man would have encountered in a rigidly stratified society. Yet his life and his search for a different way of living was not dissimilar to those individuals who were writing the Upanishads around the time he began teaching, except that they lived in retreat from the world, whereas the Buddha engaged with teaching in the world for 45 years. He continued to teach until he was 80, when he apparently succumbed to food poisoning. The emphasis of his teaching was on the development of insight, as well as compassion for all living beings. Now he said that our ordinary, we have two aspects to our nature. And here we can compare Hinduism. We have the ordinary mind, the generally accepted mind that we have still today, dominated by the ego and survival instincts. And we have the whole, complete, or cosmic mind, our Buddha nature. And the true purpose of our existence should be to seek the experience of a whole, the cosmic Buddha mind, and free ourselves from the control of the ego, which acts as an organ of limitation and gives rise to dukkha, or suffering. Now he's very clear about that, these two different kinds of mind. So if the cosmic or Buddha mind is our natural condition, our essential nature, what prevents us from experiencing it right now, today? And the answer is the innate conditioning of the ego that tries to adapt to the deficient values that govern the world, the intractable power of our survival instincts, and the social conditioning and programming we receive as we grow up. These can give rise to dukkha or suffering until we become aware of their influence and free ourselves from this conditioning. So how do we awaken to our true nature? And the Buddha said, by following the Noble Eightfold Path. The image of the Eightfold Path is reflected in this diagram of 8 spokes of a wheel, connected to the symbol of the sound Om in the center. You can see the 8 spokes. Jim Garrison gave wonderful talks on two great books talks in the Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism by Lama Anagarika de Govinda in February on the meaning of the sound Om and also Om Mani Padme Hum. This illustration is taken from the Lama's book. So we come to the Noble Eightfold Path, and here the word samyak has been translated as right, but it can also be translated as perfect. There are those two different interpretations, right and perfect. So we have right understanding, right intentions, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Right has the sense of singleness of purpose or alignment with a spiritual goal. Neither right nor perfect is exact, but there's best we can do. It has a more subtle meaning. Samyak has a more subtle meaning, difficult to define. Following the Eightfold Path initiates an alchemical transformation whereby the base metal of our consciousness is transformed into gold. Remember, alchemy is really at the root of all this teaching. The Buddha taught his followers to live by 5 moral precepts, which prohibit killing living things, taking what is not given, sexual misconduct or promiscuity, lying, and using drugs or intoxicants. He was very clear about those 5 moral precepts. And he also taught them about the 3 poisons, which he said were anger, desire or craving, and ignorance. And he said, thou shalt remove the inner attitudes towards other beings of anger, of resentment, of exploitation, of the lust of the heart. Now, the Buddha's teaching was empirical because personal experience was the final test of truth. It wasn't a doctrine handed down. He put all the emphasis on personal experience and discovery. It was scientific because it examined cause and effect. It was pragmatic because his teachings were only of use if they were found to have results. It was therapeutic. One thing I teach, suffering and the end of suffering. It was psychological rather than metaphysical, identifying specific human problems. It was egalitarian. He opened his order to all, regardless of caste or gender, and his appeal was to the individual, not to a specific group or caste. This was all absolutely revolutionary. The Buddha offered a path of freedom from religious indoctrination and control. He offered a path of practices based on observation and meditation, not an ideology or a religious belief system. He offered a therapeutic approach to human suffering with profound psychological insight and compassion. He taught people that they were not condemned to accept their fate, their karma. They had the power to change it. Therefore, they weren't powerless. He taught them to question everything and not to accept blindly the things they were told by their priests. And he offered women the possibility of following his teaching, although Buddhist nuns never held the same status as monks and still do not. He created a community called a Sangha. To begin with, this was a monastic community, and later partly a monastic one and partly a lay one. And he taught that there were 3 refuges: his own teachings, what's called the Dharma, or the path of truth, and the Sangha, or community of monks. He divided his year into 9 months of teaching and 3 months of retreat with his monks during the rainy season. He taught for long hours, but withdrew for meditation 3 times a day. The Buddha's teaching was motivated by compassion above all. He was a master of dialogue and dialectic with a brilliant analytical mind. At the same time, he was infinitely considerate and compassionate. By his acceptance of those of the lowest caste whom he welcomed into his order, he bestowed self-respect on them and challenged ingrained social attitudes towards them. He was like a physician, examining the symptoms, diagnosing the illness, and offering the cure. Wanting to draw the arrows of sorrow from everyone he met, he gave to each his sympathy, his enlightenment, and the strange power of soul, which even when he did not speak a word, gripped the hearts of his visitors and left them transformed. This comes through very, very clearly, particularly in the next example. One day, the Buddha came across a poor man sorting through a pile of rubbish. Sunita, for that was his name, wanted to hide from the Buddha in shame because he was an outcast, but he was rooted to the ground in awe and joy. The Buddha perceived the potential for Buddhahood in the heart of Sunita, shining like a lamp within a jar. And he said to him, "Sunita, could you bear to leave your present condition in life?" And Sunita, experiencing the rapture of one who has been sprinkled with ambrosia, replied, if such as I may become a monk of yours, may the Exalted One suffer me to come forth." And so Sunita became a renowned member of the order. And I'm sure this was typical of the Buddha's response to people who were in this lowest caste, really had a terrible fate in the India of that time. It was a very moving story. Now, the Buddha's teaching was really revolutionary because he rejected the Hindu concept of Brahman, the supreme transcendent creator God, and everything to do really with the Hindu teaching of that time. His own shamanic experience of awakening would have given him access to a transcendent reality, but he would not speak about it. It would have flooded him with an experience of overwhelming love, as well as illumination and insight. He apparently also rejected the Hindu concept of an indwelling divine self, or Atman. He concluded that there was no permanent I or soul that was present throughout the chain of incarnations. This is a very, very profound shift from Hinduism here. On the other hand, the Lama Anagarika Govinda, in his book, The Way of the White Clouds, describes several cases where a deceased Tibetan teacher returns in a new incarnation, and the child remembers objects that belonged to him in his previous life as a Lama, and even a dog who recognizes his former master in the child, which is rather fascinating. So I don't think it's as fixed as it's made out to be. But he did say there is nothing fixed and permanent in this ever-changing experience of samsara, that is the chain of lives, whether in relation to the outer world or the inner world of our thoughts and emotions. Everything is in a continuous state of flux, a continuous state of movement and change. All sentient beings carry the potential for Buddhahood. This implies an indwelling potential for a higher state of consciousness. The higher state of being should be the object of our search rather than the transient concerns which occupy so much of our lives. I think we have to understand that by non-existence or emptiness or no permanent self, the Buddha was teaching that since everything is constantly changing, everything is ephemeral, no actual form is eternal. The whole process of evolving life might be called interdependent co-arising. He's referring to the constructions of the ego or the conventional familiar self that most of us live by, and the world we create and become involved in with that self. I've got a big note at the end for you to read if you're interested. And those of you who are interested in Jung should remember his concept of the greater self within the soul. Now, his teaching was a tremendous challenge to the sclerotic state of the Hindu religion at his time and to the ruling Brahmin priesthood, who must have been outraged by what he was teaching. It challenged the rigidity of the caste system and the purity and exclusivity of the Aryan or Brahmin race. It challenged the fatalism and sense of helplessness derived from the doctrine of karma, the belief that man had no free will. And it challenged the cruel and contemptuous way people treated others because of their lowly caste or darker colored skin, which derived from the belief that their actions in former lives had placed them in this position. Those with darker skin did all the menial and dangerous jobs. And it also finally challenged the way women were regarded, because they too had a Buddha nature and could have access to it. This was absolutely inconceivable in the time that he was living, that women should have anything at all that was of interest. Can't help adding that, it's so true. So Buddhism was fundamentally a practice, a method of self-examination and self-transformation, and a moral teaching about how to live life in a more conscious and compassionate way. It is not and never has been a religion. It worships no God and has no priesthood, although it has teachers. Living in a society which was rigidly divided into castes and where the poor lived in indescribable poverty and misery, the Buddha developed a teaching that was based not on belief but on self-inquiry, a teaching that was applicable to all, no matter what their caste or gender. And it was this that was so revolutionary. No one had treated all people as equal in the sense that all experienced suffering and all had a Buddha nature and could have access to it. He contrasted the state of consciousness controlled by the ego that he called samsara with the enlightened or illumined state that he called nirvana, giving people the practices and insights that could help them move from the ego-bound state grounded in survival instincts to the state of luminous awareness that was released from the control of these instincts. And these practices were summarized in his formulation of the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. And so he said this, which I'd written down many years ago when I was in India. Not by any traveling is the world's end reached. Verily, I declare to you that within this fathom-long body, with its perceptions and its mind, lies the world, its arising and its ceasing, and the way that leads to its cessation. Then I'm coming on to the 5 core Buddhist values. First of all, taking responsibility for our fate, rather than just accepting it. Freedom of inquiry, insight, practical action, following the Dharma, tolerance and non-violence. The Buddhist path does not explain the ultimate meaning of our existence. It teaches us how to overcome the limitations of the situation we found ourselves in, where we are, so to say, asleep, unconscious, ignorant of who and what we essentially are, of our essential Buddha nature. I'm not sure whether the Buddha nature is within us or whether we are in the Buddha nature. Because if it's like the Hindu system, like the Atman is really within us, then one could say the Buddha nature is also within us. But if it's outside us and we have to sort of enter into it, then that's a different perception from the Atman. So he said, we and we alone are responsible for our fate. We are not the victims of our fate, or we don't need to be the victims of our fate. We have the ability to make choices. The Buddha is not a savior, but a facilitator. He was very important, laid great stress on the fact that he was a facilitator. He was not a savior. And he said, one is one's own refuge. Who else can be the refuge? Since we hold the Buddha nature, so I think within us, this is our refuge. And he said this, most importantly, in freedom of inquiry. And I wrote this down when I was 25, and I've had it with me in a book ever since. Believe nothing because a wise man said it. Believe nothing because it is generally held. Believe nothing because it is written. Believe nothing because it is said to be divine. Believe nothing because someone else believes it. Believe only what you yourself judge to be true. Thirdly, he stressed insight, because he said the root problem of humanity is ignorance, not sin. Insight is what can overcome ignorance. Insight comes through our own efforts. There is no value in belief per se, because blind faith is not helpful because it does not overcome ignorance. Fourthly, practicality. I teach only what is necessary to end human suffering. The Buddha refused to answer questions about the nature of reality, saying they were irrelevant or superfluous to what was essential. And he gave the parable of the man who has an arrow stuck in his side. And the man has one thought, which is to get rid of the arrow, not who sent the arrow, what the kind of person it was who sent the arrow, whether he was black or white, or whether he had hair or no hair. What was important was to get the arrow out of his flesh. And he considered reincarnation and karma to be among the knowable facts of life, since they were related to deep memories that were accessible to us. This fact has, I don't know if any of you know the work of Stanislav Grof, but this is really, his work has shown that we carry deep memories within all of us and that are accessible under certain conditions. And not only personal memories, but also memories to do with the whole species. And finally, he said that tolerance and non-violence were supremely important. He taught a profound tolerance, saying that everyone is at a different stage of life and on a different path to others. Truth is larger than anyone's teaching can encompass. To be attached to one's own view and look down upon other views is what wise men would call a fetter, he said. He asked people to have respect for the incompleteness of all information regarding the nature of reality, therefore to be tolerant of other people's views and beliefs. If a man says, "This is my faith," so far he maintains the truth. But by that he cannot proceed to the absolute conclusion, this alone is truth and everything else is false. And here I think we need to compare religious intolerance, for example, Islamic State and its behavior, and also the political correctness today, the absolutism of what people say has to be this and it can't be anything but this, and the attacks on anyone who challenges it. And this is something that's growing more and more in our culture and is more and more dangerous because it leads ultimately to fanaticism and gross intolerance. And what would the Buddha have thought of social media today and all the vicious attacks on other people that fill it up, so to speak? I think he would have been horrified. The main emphasis of his teaching is on love and compassion. Compassion for all sentient beings flowed from the heart of the Buddha like water from a fountain. I think his most important task may have been to awaken the heart chakra in those he was teaching. He said that all good works, whatever, are not worth 1/16th part of love, which sets free the heart. Love which sets free the heart shines and gives light and radiance. Like a mother who protects her child, her only child, with her own life, one should cultivate a heart of unlimited love and compassion towards all living beings. So we come now to what is enlightenment. I think it's the experience of our original Buddha mind, or our whole state of being, which gives rise to a perfect freedom, perfect contentment and joy, deep insight, deep trust in life, and elimination of the fear of death. This is the essence of the shamanic experience of cosmic consciousness, known to shamans and mystics and great teachers of many cultures. And I think it's important to remember this today when there is such fear now of this virus, and many people are absolutely panic-stricken by fear. And if you can tune into this Buddha state, you eliminate the fear of death because you know there is no death. This is something that he taught. And he laid great emphasis on these four immeasurables. The Dalai Lama mentions these in his booklet, A Call to Revolution, and says they are essential qualities to cultivate. And the first of these is equanimity, that is, staying balanced and calm in a state where everybody else is being terrified. Love, compassion, and joy. Most important is joy. Without these four immeasurables, the enlightened awareness of the Buddha nature would be experienced as barren. They are intrinsic to the Buddha state of luminous awareness. Enlightenment is awareness suffused with boundless love, boundless compassion, boundless joy, and unshakable equanimity. These qualities are intrinsic to our Buddha nature. They are beacons that orient us towards the unfolding of our Buddha nature. Essentially, they are qualities that radiate from the heart. Practicing the Noble Eightfold Path over time eliminates the obstacles within us that prevent these radiant qualities from filling our being and informing our actions. So most important, these four immeasurables, perhaps the most important teaching of his whole path of life. Now, nirvana is not a place like heaven. It's not a God realm. It's a permanent, unconditioned state of being. It is unborn, not becoming, not made. It is ageless, deathless, joyful, and blissful. It is to be in touch with the flow of life in oneself and everything else, to relinquish grasping or wanting or craving or being attached to what one has or to what one fears losing. It is complete freedom from conditions and limitations, allowing life to be lived in the full experience of the present moment. It's an expression of ordinary consciousness. It's an expansion of ordinary consciousness to cosmic consciousness, a state of complete awareness and unity with life. This was a definition that a Buddhist teacher in a place in Bangkok gave me many, many years ago. He said, samsara, or life as you know it now, becomes nirvana, or life as it really is. We all have the potential within us to connect with this life as it truly is, if we reflect on it enough. And this is what someone who has experienced enlightenment in this way has written. He said, my daily activities are not different, only I am naturally in harmony with them. Taking nothing, renouncing nothing, in every circumstance, no hindrance, no conflict. Drawing water, carrying firewood. This is supernatural power. This is the marvelous activity. The Buddha's teachings are known as the Dharma. He taught that wisdom, kindness, patience, generosity, and compassion were the most important virtues. How should we relate to the Dharma? People asked. If you cling to it, if you treasure it, if you're attached to it, then you do not understand that the teaching is like a raft, which is for crossing over, not for clinging to. In other words, he didn't want them to make a doctrine of his teaching, but a practice. Every individual has a unique path. Everyone has a Buddha nature. Speaking to Ananda, his closest disciple, he said, therefore, Ananda, be ye lamps unto yourselves. Be ye a refuge to yourselves. Betake yourself to no external refuge. Hold fast to the Dharma as a lamp. Hold fast to the Dharma as a refuge. Look not for any refuge in anyone besides yourselves. This is an extraordinary teaching. It really is. The Dammapada is an anthology written in Pali of 423 verses that were attributed to the Buddha himself, holding some of his thoughts recorded by his monks over his 45 years of teaching. And I just chosen a few of them because they struck me as so beautiful and so appropriate. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. So our life is the creation of our mind. As a fletcher makes straight his arrow, so does the wise man make straight the mind, which trembling and unsteady is difficult to guard and restrain. The perfume of flowers cannot travel against the wind, but the sweet perfume of compassion travels against the wind and reaches the end of the world with its fragrance. And here are a few more. All beings fear danger. Life is dear to all. When a man considers this, he does not kill or cause to kill. He who for the sake of happiness hurts others who also want happiness shall not hereafter find happiness. Those who make channels for water control the waters. Makers of arrows make the arrows straight. Carpenters control the timber, and the holy control their soul. Oh, let us live in joy, in love, among those who hate. Among men who hate, let us live in love. Oh, let us live in joy, in peace, among those who struggle. Let us live in peace. This is a quotation from the Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism. For the Buddha, the duality of the body and soul does not exist. Among bodily, mental, psychic, and spiritual functions, there is only a difference in degree, but not in essence. So when the mind has become luminous, the body too must partake of this luminous nature. And another beautiful saying here, the sun shines by day and the moon shines by night. The warrior shines in his armor, the Brahmin in his meditation. But the Buddha shines by day and by light. In the brightness of his glory shines the man who is awake. The Buddha valued peace and quiet, and when he was present in the assembly, the disciples found that he sat so perfectly still that the whole scene was said to resemble a lake of lotuses waiting for the sunrise. And he said, these are his last words, regard this phantom world as a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom, and a dream. All compounded things decay. Work out your own salvation with diligence. Now I realize an hour has gone by. Is it to go on for about 10 or minutes? Yeah, okay. The stupa. This is a stupa at Sanchi. The stupa marks the place where an axis arose from beneath the earth into the world of man. A platform was built with its four sides representing the four directions of space. Within this square was placed a circle divided into 8 equal segments, indicating the cardinal and intermediate directions, like the spread out petals of a lotus rising from beneath the earth, or the noble Eightfold path. Upon the circular lotus arose the hemispherical dome, facing the arc of the heavens from ground level to zenith. The stupa thus represented a monumental image of the Buddha's presence and doctrine. When the Buddha died, he was cremated and his ashes were divided between 8 different stupas in principal places where he had taught, corresponding to the Noble Eightfold Path. Stupas were beautifully sculptured with figures of animals and trees and foliage. And it is clear that people really loved the Buddha, felt loved by him, and were devoted to his memory. So this is an image of the Buddha asleep from the Tunhuang caves in China, which I always wanted to visit myself, but I never was able to because I couldn't go to China at the time I was able to, wasn't allowed in. Now I've done a comparison of the common ground in Buddhism and Hinduism, which I'll just briefly go over it, because both of them believed in reincarnation and karma. Both of them said ignorance or unconsciousness is the main problem. Both of them said the ego is not our true, essential, or complete self. Both of them said ordinary existence is like a dream or virtual reality. And they said that there is a necessity to wake up from believing that this dream is reality. They said that our nature is not whole or complete, and we have the possibility of awakening to our Buddha or our Atman nature. Methods of awakening are the same: meditation, insight, service, and way of living is the same: compassion and non-violence. So there was a lot that the Buddha took from Hinduism, and it's all really here on this page. So you can see how they compare, really. Hinduism had the supreme being. Buddhism, the Buddha would never speak of a supreme being. Hinduism had a priesthood. Buddhism had monks and nuns. Hinduism had a ritual. Buddhism had no ritual. Hinduism had caste. Buddhism, no caste. Hinduism, the indwelling Atman. Buddhism, the Buddha nature. Meditation, common to both. And enlightenment, common to both. So there are very many similarities there. Both of them emphasize the release from the deceptive spell of Maya and from samsara, or the wheel of rebirth. Now, to end, I just want to speak briefly about the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, because I think it might interest you, and it really fits in as a following on, really, from this great Buddhist teaching. Avalokiteshvara is the Bodhisattva whose mission is to watch over the world until the coming of the future Buddha Maitreya. And the name in Sanskrit means he who hears the cries of the world. And his mantra is Om Mani Padme Hum. Houston Smith says that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara because his entire teaching has been about compassion. He writes that the Dalai Lama is the receiving station towards which the compassion principle of Buddhism in all its cosmic amplitude is continuously channeled to radiate to the Tibetan people most directly, but by extension to all sentient beings. And the famous vow of the Bodhisattva says, "Whatever be the highest perfection of the human mind, may I realize it for the benefit of all living beings. Even though I may have to take upon myself all the sufferings of the world, I will not forsake my aim and my fellow creatures in order to win salvation for myself alone." And this is the most exquisite fresco from the Ajanta caves. I saw it when I visited them. It was absolutely overwhelmingly beautiful. And it's caught in this magnificent photograph. This is the Bodhisattva, whether the Buddha himself or the one who is to come. And finally, I'm just going to speak briefly about the net of Indra. which is also in my book, The Dream of the Cosmos, and I've given the page numbers. In India, there's long been an exquisite image of the cosmic web of life known as the net of Indra, king of the gods in the Vedic pantheon. This jewel, diamond, or pearl-studded net, delicate as a silken spider's web, was said to be suspended over Indra's palace on Mount Meru, the holy mountain, and the axis mundi of Vedic cosmology, that I'd found represented everywhere in temple sculpture on my journeys through India, Cambodia, and Indonesia. The Buddha himself once described the cosmos as a web of golden threads joining myriad, many-faceted jewels, each reflecting the multi-hued light of all the others. The jewels or pearls represent the souls of animate beings, and each jewel holds a boundless universe of images and experiences, since all souls carry a fathomless past and are connected to each other through the net. So that's the end of my talk on the Buddha. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, dear, and this was beautiful. This particular lecture of yours is like music to my ears, or rather to my heart, because I'm myself a Buddhist practitioner. So I'm closely watching the time. I initially had 2 questions or comments, but I will just reduce it to 1, so to give opportunity for our audience to ask questions from you as well. And the first is actually, I found an amazing quotation from this absolutely wonderful book by Eightfold, Mysticism, a Study and an Anthology. This is on Anne's reading list, so in case you wish to read it, which I highly recommend, then please email me because I have it in PDF version. So here goes the quotation, and after that I ask the question. While Buddhism does not recognize a God of the sort found in theologies of religions such as Christianity and Islam, at the heart of the deepest Buddhist insight and spirituality, there is some non-personal ultimate reality, a primal meaning, an undivided unity. It is found in a concept of the void, sunyata, which resembles the Godhead of Eckhart and the Dharmakaya, which has affinities with the Tao of Chinese mystical tradition and perhaps with the mystical interpretation of the Torah of Judaism. This deity, this Buddhist God image, can only be realized in that ultimate mystical experience in which all images, all mental processes, all forms fade away in a bare, undifferentiated awareness. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and thank you for adding that, because that really was missing from my talk, and you've added in perfectly.
Oh, thank you so much. But then that was I'd like to ask this question from you. I know that I asked this question at Professor Jim Garrison's lecture on the foundation of Tibetan mysticism, that if the Buddha was here, in your understanding, what would he say, especially in the challenge of this coronavirus?
He would say, you're all sound asleep and you need to wake up. He would start again, same teaching that he's given, all the 5 precepts of things we have to avoid, realizing that we have a Buddha nature, which we've completely forgotten about, and realizing that the ego nature we have is not enough, it's not our complete self. He would say all those things all over again, which is why I so much like his teaching, because it's absolutely appropriate for today.
It is, absolutely.
Very easy to grasp. It's not difficult to grasp at all.
Yeah. Just need to take responsibility for our actions. Now, let's see that are there any questions? So far, nobody put their hand up. So, Amy Blumenschein, might we have that quote written? Which quote do you mean? My quote, Amy? Okay, then she will respond when she can. Let me just, sorry, there are 2 people put their hand up. Paolo Morley Fletcher, let's hear from you. And then from our dear Professor Garrison. So Georg, whose lines are you opening first?
Both coming up.
Excellent.
Paolo?
Hello.
Hi, Paolo.
Hi, Paolo.
Hi there. Thanks again. I'll be short given the little time we have. The question I have very simply is, what is the soul according to Buddha? So I've heard you speaking about the anatman and the potential for the Buddha's nature we have all inside of us, but also seen the mentioning the word soul here and there. So in few words, would you like to elaborate on that?
It's difficult, Paolo, because
Yeah.
the word soul I mentioned with, and I think it was the America Govinda, Lama Anagarita Govinda who mentioned it, and it's not me. But I have wondered about that all the way through. I don't think that he probably used the concept soul in the context of when he was teaching and living. It's something that comes from Christianity much more. So I think we shouldn't worry about it. He just contrasted the two different natures, the ordinary mind and the Buddha nature. And as I said, I'm not sure whether we are in the Buddha nature. I think we are, rather than having the Buddha nature within us. It's something that we have to open our consciousness to, rather than think of it as something within ourselves, I think.
Yeah,
I would say the whole thing is soul. Buddha nature is the soul. The whole thing is both soul and spirit, if you like, in the Christian sense. One mustn't get tangled up in different definitions, because I can't do that. I'm not the Buddha himself. I can't say exactly what he meant. Also, things were not written down until 150 years after his death. So that's another problem. And
I'm also, I mean, you said at the very beginning that it was the final reincarnation. So that life that he lived as a Buddha was his final reincarnation. So I was wondering, I mean, although the concept of the soul that at least we are used to, and
he said that nothing survived from incarnation to incarnation. He was very definite that there wasn't an element which did that. But on the other hand, other Buddhist teachers have said that there is. So I think one just has to keep an open mind there. And it may be that his followers said that there was no element that remained. It may not have been the Buddha himself, because, as I say, nothing was written down. So we can't be absolutely sure of what he said about those specific things. But he certainly had this, what I call his cosmic consciousness. He entered into that, and he saw the wholeness that we are and the completion that we are in our true selves. And he wanted to remove the limitations we have of our own understanding of ourselves, so that we could reach that state of being, which was so different from our normal state.
Thank you. Thank you for everything.
Trying to.
Thank you, Paolo. Great question. Absolutely brilliant question. Now, over to our dear President, Garrison.
I'm glad to see he's recovered from his flu.
I am. Thank you, Georgie. Splendid lecture. The Buddha has always been, an extraordinary figure in my life, and deeply impacted the sculpting, I think, of my deepest spirituality. One thing I'd love to have you comment on, Anne, is the relevance of Buddhism in the current world situation. Just remembering Arnold Toynbee, when he was asked to identify the greatest event of the 20th century, he said it was the arrival of Buddhism to the West. Albert Einstein contemplating all the religions from the point of view of physics and the cosmology that's been discovered by science, said that only Buddhism was the religion of the future. And so I think it's just building on Georgie's comment about God and sort of this primitive notion, even Paolo, this notion of the soul. Most of the religions are as antiquated as they are because they've come up with simplistic answers to mysteries that are unfathomable. And one of the aspects of of Buddhism that I think is going to emerge as more and more relevant over time is the fact that everything that scientists are now discovering about the cosmos was seen by the Buddha 2,500 years ago. You know, the notion that there is no separate self. Everything is a singularity. And whether it's the soul, whether it's my mind, whether it's my sight or hearing or feeling, whether it's Jupiter or the sun or the farthest galaxy, everything is interconnected to everything else. And as we all know from Nassim Haramehn's physics, it's all emanating out of the void. It's all emanating out of emptiness in an ever-changing configuration of layered reality. So, and I'd love to have you comment on this deep resonance that Buddhism seems to have almost uniquely of the great religions with the scientific descriptions of reality as they're emerging in the world today. Because if that's true, and since that's true, that has a pretty profound implication for how we should really appreciate what the Buddha taught, which you've laid out so beautifully.
Yes, I've thought about that. I think it is the most wonderful teaching for today. But also, there's an element in it which I'm going to deal with in the 5th talk, which is that there's an emphasis on really moving out of the whole thing of samsara. Where do we move to? What is the value of life on this planet if the whole aim is to move out of the state that we're in? This is one of the big questions that I have about the value of any teaching, really. But I'm going to deal with that in the last talk. But I think it's the most wonderful, as you were saying, it's absolutely connected with quantum physics today. He saw what they're discovering now, but then also the writers of the Upanishads also saw it. One mustn't forget that. That's why I put him in the context of the time of the Upanishads. They had this vision also of this wholeness and this the source that was continually creating, as it were, and bringing forth all the forms of life. But I think the teaching about compassion, I'm just going to hold up this little booklet by the Dalai Lama. Can you see it? A call to revolution in compassion. If that could become more known to young people, because he's appealing directly to young people, that could really do something, because our whole world culture has lacked compassion for so long that it's something that is not really been understood, I don't think, as a way of life and as a way of treating other people and reacting and responding to other people. We're absolutely deluged with awful remarks on social media, remarks talking about killing other people or raping other people or whatever. You know, there's so much cruelty and viciousness in the world that I think that Buddhism could be a great antidote to that. And also the teaching of non-violence, which is also the teaching of the Hindu religion and also of Christianity. But it hasn't come through to the human consciousness yet, certainly not to the leaders of nations who are going on as before in their own sort of ruts that they're stuck in. But I think it would be a most wonderful thing if it could be better known, but not in the way necessarily that's been taught for people to withdraw into retreats, but really a call to revolution, as the Dalai Lama says. We have to have a revolution in our way of thinking and our violence towards all forms of life and towards the earth itself. All this could be reframed, if you like, in the modern context. Not for people to withdraw from life, but to people to be acting as the Buddha did in life. So I agree with you entirely that it would be wonderful if it could become better known. I think Einstein said the religion of the future will be something completely beyond all the religions, almost a revelatory experience of oneness and unity.
Well, thank you.
Anyway, it's been great being here. And as I say, I'm sorry about the muddle at the beginning. It won't happen again.
Oh, that's all right. You figured it out. Well, today there
I
must
do
be
not
some.
like technology.
No, no, yeah, well, you're wonderful. You figured it out. So thank you very much. There's a question from Anika. She's asking, would you be able to include briefly indigenous shamanic traditions in this introduction and comparison of religions?
No, because if you get that book, Cosmic Consciousness, you'll understand that the indigenous cultures had that experience, going back probably to 50,000 BC, right the way through. There have been people all over the world who had that experience and who have been either repressed or ignored for thousands and thousands of years. But there won't be time to include it in my last lecture. There's too much else to go into it. I'll mention them certainly, but they've been trying to wake us up, just like the Buddha has it, to the fact that we're completely off course. And they are the people who have actually held this different perception of reality all the way through and been true to it. Whereas I would say most of the religious traditions have lost it, completely lost the plot.
Yeah, yeah. And just for one second, referring to what Jim was saying, that how, and you were saying as well, that how relevant Buddhism is today. I read many years ago that as sad and awful it was that the Chinese takeover of Tibet, but yet the Dalai Lama said that it allowed Buddhism to evolve.
That's right.
Because it is actually evolving in the West. So just in reference to what's going on with the coronavirus, that it is sad to see thousands of people dying and losing their lives. At the same time, we can observe that our waterways are cleaner, the air is cleaner. So there are always two sides of the coin. And and on this point, I'd like to make an announcement that please join our UBverse platform, because since the day before yesterday, we're having a daily webinar of good series. It is free and all of you have access to it. Just need to register. And we are addressing the hyper complexity of our times every day and how to cope with the coronavirus and all the challenges with regard to that. So please join us there. And thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Paolo and Jim, for your comments, and Amy and Danica. We shall see you all next Thursday, same time, same place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Georgie.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.